Hey guys, in this video we are talking about an intermediate node tree in Davinci Resolve. So without any further ado, let's just jump into Davinci and get started. We are inside of Davinci Resolve and we will start out by building our node tree, the intermediate node tree that we're going to work with and the workflow that we are going to go through. For the first part, let's do our color space transform before we build out the node tree. Because if you're not shooting in log, this will not apply to you. So let's get that out of the way before we do anything else. So the way that we convert it is by choosing the color space transform in here. From the effects tab, dragging it onto our node, and then we choose our parameters. My footage is shot in log, that's why we're doing it. So it's shot in Canon log 3 and in the color space Canon Cinema Gamut. The color space that we're converting it into is Rec 709 and Gamma 2.4. And before any of you go with questions on my color management, it is just set to timeline color space Rec 709 and Rec 709. It's not even in Gamma 2.4 because everything I manage with the nodes here. With that out of the way, let's label this Rec 709 so we know what it is. Let's put it all the way to the right because we're not going to care about this anymore. The only thing this did was convert our footage from this flat log profile into Rec 709, opened it up a little bit more. Now let's add another node before, so a serial node before, and build out our node tree. We could also have a color space transform in the beginning, that would be Davinci Wide Gamut, but in this case we're not going to do this. We're just going to go with a more simple node tree. So for our color correction, we're going to have 3 nodes, and we are calling those contrast, exposure, and white balance. Okay, after that we are going to have 4 nodes. This one is going to be our blacks that we're going to fix if needed. This one is going to be our luminance. This one is going to be our curves. And this one is our primaries. Then after that, we're going to go with our masking. So for that, we are going to make parallel nodes. So we're going to make 2 parallel nodes down here. And to make it a little bit more, we are going to add an outside node here. So this one is what I call the focus. It's actually adding contrast, and this one will be our defocus. I know we're going a little bit fast, but this is just a serial node after the blacks. These are parallel nodes underneath that you add by adding parallel nodes. I have it on option A as well as my keyboard shortcut. So these all feed into the layer mixer here. You can also make our node tree a little bit more structured by doing it like so. Maybe the workflow makes a bit more sense like this, moving it up. And this is an outside node, so we added that by adding a node, outside node, which will select everything that we are not selecting in the first one. So focus and defocus, I'll show you, and that will make sense in a second. And this one is going to be our highlights. This is going to be our shadow mask. And this is pretty much how our structure is set up. The reason why we set this up before we did anything else is because I want to show you, if you go into your gallery and your power grades, you can rename this, you can add another one if you want. If you now right click on your clip and say grab still, you can say this is our intermediate node tree. So what this does is that if we reset everything over here again, now you can see we are back to our log footage. Everything is set back to how it was before. If you now go into our gallery, the stills will be for only this project, but the power grade will be throughout all the projects in this folder. So if you go to our homepage, this is my color grades projects library, and this is the project that we're in right now. All the projects in this one has the same power grade folders, so it goes across all of them. That means that now we have our intermediate node tree. I can double click this and voila, we have our node tree again. The only thing you need to delete is this one extra node that is always there. And now if we drag everything out a little bit, now we have our node tree again. And we also have our conversion. So if you're not shooting in log, you can avoid this, or you can of course have this as your parameters. You can also save different versions so that it's easy to get to this node tree every time that you're doing it. And if this went a little bit too fast, go back and have a look again and how we did this and how we set up this node tree. But essentially a lot of serial nodes and then our parallel nodes for masking, one outside node here. So with that said, let's head into our color correction. That's the first thing that we do. And this is the only time that we move backwards. So we're starting with the contrast. And for that, we will head into our custom curves here. We will make a point in the shadows and drag those down. Then we will make a point in the highlights and drag those up. This way, we got a lot more contrast. And of course, you can go with this to your liking, but don't be afraid to go a little bit too far. In this case, I want to raise the blacks just a little bit here as well, just make that a little bit softer. And you can see on our waveform down here that we are way too far. We have not clip highlights, but they're close to, and we also have a little bit of clip shadows somewhere. So it's close to being too much, but that's where we now head into our exposure. So for our exposure, I actually want to pull up the gamma just a little bit to begin with. We don't need to adjust the exposure itself with the offset because it's pretty balanced already. And now it's a little bit too bright, so that's going to be countered by dragging the lift down by 1. And I might want to decrease the highlights just a little bit as well, around 20. And let's see how that looks. I just made it a little bit less contrasty, and I like that because then we can add a little bit more contrast later. But if we look at what these two notes did, it went from this flat, which is converted into Rec 709 already, into this. And if we remove the contrast, it would still be very flat. So that's why we add the contrast first, because then we can adjust our exposure. And of course we can go in and adjust our contrast as well, but we do it this way around so that we don't have to go back and forth too many times. Now for our white balance, sometimes I like to adjust my skin tones because it looks a little bit off, but I actually think it captured the image pretty well this time, so I'll leave it alone. But if you have an ND filter on, that usually makes some differences. Sometimes I go -2 on the tint and +50 on the temperature, and you can see I just gave it a little bit more warmth everywhere, but I think we will actually leave this alone for now. But it's always nice to have the white balance in case your camera messed it up or you just want to make small tweaks to that. So that was our color correction, the contrast, the exposure, and the white balance. From that, we move on to our primaries. In the primaries, we're working with the lift, gamma, and gain. And in this case, I just want to add a little bit of a teal and orange look. So I'm going to click on the blue point here in the lift, and I'm going to raise that to 0.03. That'll make everything a little bit blue. To make that teal, we need to add green as well, but not as much green as blue. So we're going to add 0.2 into this. That makes everything nice and teal. And just to emphasize it a little bit, we're going to push it even further by decreasing the red channel. So -0.01. And that just made everything very nice teal color, but it also influenced everything else. So what we do now is we can counter that. So we can go to the blue channel and the gamma. And we can go -0.03 and -0.02 in the greens. And with that, we actually have a pretty nice look. Now, we could add one red here, but I think that makes everything a little bit too red. So we're actually going to leave the red channel at 0. And that way we have this soft teal look. You can see that everywhere. And we're not necessarily going to keep that for the entire thing. But for a starting point, I like that. And I like to do it before the curves because now we have our look locked in and now we can go into our curves and set those exactly how we want them. So let's head into the curves. And for this, we are using the hue versus hue, the hue versus sat, and the hue versus luminance. The first thing I always do is lock in my skin tones. So just switching to the vector scope to see where the skin tones lie. I'm assuming that's around here. We want them to lie a little bit more on the line. And if you can't see this line, one thing you can go in and do is click this and then say show skin tone indicator. That'll bring out this line, which is supposed to show you where the skin tone is supposed to be. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit here, and I'm going to drag a nice sample of my skin tones here to make sure that we have that. That is locked in here. I'm going to do the same for the luminance, for the saturation, sorry, and then for the luminance, like so. And that should give us the exact same points in all different ones with slight variations, maybe because the saturation is a little bit more here. Now I do feel that it lies pretty well in between the red and the yellows, but I might want it to be ever so slightly in one or the other direction. So let's just try and see if we rotate the hue down here to around 10. That definitely got too red. So let's see if we do -10, that's too yellow. -5. That sits somewhere between where we want it. So I'm just going to play around with this to see where we land. I think this rotation to 2, just rotating it slightly up, makes it a little bit better. So I like this a little bit more. But because it now pushed it a little more towards the red channel, which is a primary color, we are going to go into the saturation and we are going to counter that a little bit. So go 0.95. And that way we are countering the saturation. We gained a little bit more saturation from doing the hue rotation here. And maybe we even desaturated a bit much. So going by this. now you can see we still have the same saturation, but we just have a slightly more red skin color than the yellow one. And you can also see that from this, we are moving this line, that is the skin tones, more towards being straight on the line, because we're moving it more toward the red channel here. That is a primary color. Now, if we go into the luminance, I just want to give it a little bit of a push in the luminance as well. So let's try and go 1.1. It's very subtle, but just gives it a little bit more color here. Okay, that's it for the skin tones. Now we can color grade the rest. So let's go back to our hue versus hue channel. And for this, I'm just going to make a point around here to adjust our green reds. And I just want to make our green and yellow, sorry. Just want to make our greens a little bit more yellow, like so. And then I want to make my teals or blues a little bit more teal. So I'm going to drag up a point here. And then we have our red motorbike here. Just going to see where that lies. That is around here. I'm going to remove that point. And then I'm just going to drag this down a little bit to make sure that it has a nice red color, not too orange, but somewhere around here. Maybe actually just make sure that I'm pushing the more magenta tones towards the red or towards the blue channel. It's very subtle, but this is where we're at so far. Let's head into our saturation and do sort of the same. I'm going to push up the greens a little bit. I'm going to push down around here just to desaturate those. I want to desaturate the reds here a little bit too, and the blues somewhat. And then in the luminance, I'm going to pull up the luminance here and do the same thing by pulling it down. Now, the look is very subtle. You can see when we turn it on and off, it doesn't do that much, it just does a little bit. And when I'm looking at the skin tones, I'm actually liking how it looked before a little bit more. So I'm going to go back to my hue rotation here, and I'm just going to reset my reds here. It's still desaturated a little bit because I like that look a little bit more, but let's leave it at this. So I think that's pretty good for our curves. We don't have to go too crazy. We can do subtle adjustments. Luminance, what I like to do here is just to add a little bit more contrast. So I go into the curve here, the saturation versus luminance. And what I like to do is to pinpoint my skin tones again. So I'm just going to draw out a sample, and the skin tones lie around here. So what I do is I take my point that is in the shadows and actually drag that down a little bit. That will create some more contrast, and that'll create some separation between the skin tones and the rest. So you can see that if we go to full screen, this makes me as a subject here stand out a lot more. And what we can do as well, if we can try and drag up the other side a little bit as well, not too much, and you want to go subtle, and we might actually want to drag up the shadows just a little bit as well, so that it's more subtle. But you can see we got a little bit more light or brightness into the skin up here, and we darkened the background a little bit as well, just to get a little bit more contrast and a little bit more focus. It sharpens the image up and it makes it stand out a little bit more. Now what I want to do with the blacks is I want to go into my parade scope here, and I want to have a look at where my tones are lying down here. Now I can see that my reds are clipping a little bit. They are moving below. So what I want to do here is I want to make sure that our blacks is actually black and not tealish. So I'm going to go into my color wheels, and I'm going to go to my log wheels instead of our primaries. And I'm going to play around with the shadows here. I'm going to raise the red a little bit and see if I can match where the red, the green and the blue are lying here. So the blue is being dragged down a little bit. And you can just see how that went from that tealish look into a more neutral black look. And now that I have that, I want to dial it back a little bit again. So I want to remove some of that red again, because I don't want it to be too strong. I still want to have our teal and orange look somewhat. So I'm just going to play around with this until I see something that I like. And I think this is pretty good. We still have a little bit of that teal tone, but it's more neutral now. And that makes it just a little bit of a nicer, more neutral and natural look. So that was it for our color grading. If we mark all of those and see what we did, this is before. This is without any of our color grade adjustments, and this is after. So we still have that a little bit teal and orange look, and we have a lot more contrast because we turned down the luminance of the background a little bit. So I think that looks pretty good. I'm happy to move on. And this is where we get a little bit more advanced than what we've done before, at least in these tutorials on the node trees. So now we get to the masking. And for the masking, we're going into the focus mask first, and we're going to make a circular mask. Now, I'm not moving in this clip at all, as you can see, very slightly. So I think we can make a mask right in the center here. And what I want to make sure is that I cover myself. So I'm going to click Shift H to see what we're covering here. I'm going to drag it out just to feather it, and I'm going to make sure that I have me selected. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger because we're feathering it out so much. Something like this, Shift H again. And here I want to add somewhat of contrast. First, I want to see what happens if I drag up my highlights a little bit. I think that still looks pretty good. And then drag down my shadows a little bit as well, just to create some more contrast. I think, again, that looks pretty good. Just brightening it up, putting a little bit more focus on this area because our eyes are naturally drawn to the brighter parts. So that's what I'm trying to achieve here. Now, as said, we made an outside node, add node, outside node. This is the node that we have here. So if I select this node, defocus, and click Shift H, you can see that it selects everything but me, pretty much. It's feathered out a lot, so it is still selecting a little bit of me. But what we can do here, and what I like to do, is to go back into our wheels, and then into our primaries again. And I just like to drag the gamma down a little bit. And what this does is that it removes some of the luminance of the outside area of where I am. And with that, actually, if we turn on and off the focus mask, we turn on and off both of them because then nothing is selected in the defocus. And you see, this just created a lot more focus on me and drew the attention away from the background. Because right now, it's still a little bit flat. We still have a lot of luminance in the background. But by doing this, we put more focus on me and less focus on the background. So this is a neat trick of a mask to make sure that everything looks great. Now, our second mask will be our highlights. So what I want to go in and do here is I want to create a mask, a circular one again. And I want to have a look at where the light is coming from. So it looks like it's coming from somewhat up top or somewhat behind, because you can see that's a little bit of a halo here and there's some here. You can also see that I have some highlights on my face here. So I think it's coming from up top somewhere here. I can't actually remember where the sun was when we were shooting this, and I think it was a little bit cloudy. So I'm gonna move it up somewhere here. It's not that important that it's in this exact right spot. What I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna drag it up so that it just covers most of the image, but it makes a nice soft feather. I put the softness up to 100, so something like this. Then I'm actually gonna keep it in this mode so I can see what I'm doing. And then I'm going to go to my eyedropper or my qualifier. I'm gonna leave the hue and the saturation alone. You don't actually have to turn them off, but we're going to do it for this sake. And then I'm gonna take the darkest points and I'm gonna drag this up. And when I start to see that it's deselecting things, I'm going to go to the low soft and add 15 here. I'll just make sure that it's a softer transition. What I wanna do is I wanna drag it up so that I'm mostly just affecting the brighter parts of the image, which I am now. And then I'm gonna get it some blur, usually around 30 works pretty well. Maybe actually drag it up just a little bit more. And by doing this, turning that off, I can now go into my curves again. I can raise my highlights again, maybe drag down my whites a little bit. And with this, I can create a lot more luminance in the highlights without touching any of the shadows. And I'm also making it stronger from the corner up here and out because I'm using a power window, a circular power window. By this, we can add a little bit of warmth maybe. So 0.03, 0.02 here. And I'll just add a little bit more of a yellow tone, which gives us this idea that it's coming in from the right and it's sunlight. And for our last mask here, this shadow mask, I'm going to go in and make a power window that is squared. I'm going to drag it out to the side and drag it down. Turn it a little bit, and then I'm just going to feather it in. And you might have guessed it already, but we're going to do the exact same here. So this is what I have selected. Now I'm going to go to my eyedropper tool or my qualifier. I'm going to turn down the luminance here. Start seeing when I'm losing the detail in the highlights. I'm going to turn the high soft up to 50 or 15, sorry. And then I'm going to drag it out a little bit again, just to make sure that what we have deselected is the highlights. And we have that right about now. I think that looks good. Turning that down, and then we're going in and we're going to add some more contrast to the shadows here, just by turning the shadows down a little bit. And I want to go back to my waveform to make sure that I'm not clipping too much detail here. like so. Maybe drag the blacks up a little bit to make sure it's not too much. Something like this. Pretty dramatic difference. It looks good. And then we could add a little bit more of teal tones into this. So let's just see if we make 0.2 and 0.1, adding back a little bit more of that teal color. I like that. I like how it looks. And if we select all of our masks here and go back into full screen, this is with them turned off, and this is with it turned on. So with all of our collective here, this is our entire grade. So without the color corrections, if I turn that off, this is what it looked like when we corrected our image to look as close to what it did in real life as possible. And this is with our color grade. Maybe it's a bit strong in some of the highlights, so we could go in and adjust that. But overall, I'm pretty happy with this look. It looks a little bit more teal and orange, but it is not too much in my opinion. It still looks good. It's a creative grade, and I like how it turned out. So that is pretty much it for this kind of note tree. And as said, if you save it in the power grade, then you can always use this tree and you can go through with this workflow every time that you are going to color grade something, and it works pretty well. And it's almost the tree that I use every time I color grade. I use a little bit more tweaks that are advanced, but I wanted to make it a little bit more intermediate for you guys, depending on what level you are at the moment. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something, and until the next time, take care.